Hello, in this lecture I'm going to be giving some advice on how to write history. So I'm going to start off just talking about how I prepared a paper for the South Carolina Historical Association conference. This is kind of a local historical association. And the issue I had with it was, I'm not a specialist in the United States, but most people who attend that conference are. So I wanted to come up with a paper that would somehow connect to the United States. And I remembered that there was a man named George Ladd, that's pictured here on the left, a very important American professor from the late 19th, early 20th century, basically helped found psychology as a discipline. I believe he was a professor at Princeton, and he was famous for all those different things that he did here, very important person in American history. But he also wrote a book called In Korea with Marquis Ito. Marquis is like a rank, it's like a duke or some kind of noble person. Ito was an important Japanese official. And basically, Ito had been put in charge of Korea by the Japanese. And Ladd went to visit him to kind of write about what was happening in Korea under increasing Japanese power. So I thought that might be interesting to talk about. So just to give you some background on Korean history to help you understand this, in 1905, after Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, Japan established what's called a protectorate in Korea, which basically gave Japan power over Korea's diplomatic affairs. Japan would go increasingly take power in Korea based on that, and then 1910 would just annex Korea outright, make it a part of the Japanese Empire. And so in that period between 1905 and 1910, Koreans tried to challenge the legitimacy of Japanese power in Korea. Many Koreans said, the Japanese should not be here. This is illegal what they're doing. That's wrong. Please, other people in the world, please help us get the Japanese out. And at the same time, the Japanese and pro-Japanese people like George Ladd tried to say that Japan should be in Korea, that Japan being in Korea and exercising power over Koreans was helping them. And so what happened was you had pro-Japanese apologists, people who tried to argue that Japan should be in Korea, that was good for Japan, it was good for Korea, it was good for the world. They justified that by focusing on the violence, not that the Japanese were carrying out, forcing Korea to be their colony, basically, but on the violence that Koreans used either in the past or were using to fight back against the Japanese. So I said, okay, I want to talk about how people were doing this. I can look at how George Ladd did it through his book with Marquis Ito in Korea. Right? And what I did, because it's a conference paper and only have like 10 or 15 minutes to talk, is I said, I'm going to do this through 3 examples. Right? I'm going to use 3 examples to do this. So what I'm just trying to emphasize here is how I came to choose my subject. Notice I considered my audience. I said, okay, my audience is mostly going to be people interested in the United States. I have to come up with something that connects me to the US. So I'll look at Korean history using this American who wrote this book about Korea and Japan as my focus. And I had to connect that, though, to a bigger question, right? This issue essentially of how did countries justify colonization? How did they try and influence public opinion to gain their support? And one personal question I often have, I'm kind of interested in, is how do people justify violence, right? When do people find it acceptable to use violence? And by looking at this example, I could fit all those interests into one presentation. And it helps to really think about what you're trying to do and who your audience is. Now, I also had to give them, and I have to give you to help you understand the advice I'm going to give you, explain why it was important, why Japan tried to justify itself to an American professor of basically, it's complex. He was a philosopher, but he played an important role in the development of psychology. But basically, the United States and Japan were competing for power in the Pacific Ocean. And Japan wanted to make sure not to provoke the United States, because the United States was bigger and more powerful, wanted the United States to support its expansion of power into Korea, right? We want the Americans to be our friend. We don't want the Americans to oppose us going into Korea. We want them to support us going into Korea. So we need to, and the United States is a democracy, we need to try and influence public opinion to get Americans to support us going into Korea. We can do that by, say, paying for an American academic who is famous to come to Japan and come to Korea and write a book about his experiences. That would be a good thing that would help do this. Now, the example, remember I said I in my paper, one thing I should point out is that In Korea with Maki Ito is a book about 500 pages long, I think. So I'm not going to do the whole book. I'm going to give 3 examples. And I chose the issue of violence in order to kind of make it so that my examples were connected, so that there was a theme. Right? I hope that makes sense, right? The idea here is that I've got to make an argument about a book to make my point. And the argument needs to make sense. It needs to be coherent. Here's a way I can help it make sense. I'm going to focus on how he tried to use violence. Basically, the Japanese are using violence to take over Korea. Why is Japanese violence okay, but Korean violence isn't, from the perspective of Ladd and from the perspective of the pro-Japanese apologists who want to justify taking over Korea? And I'm going to give you look briefly at 2 examples I used. The first was the assassination of Queen Min. When Japan was trying to expand its power in Korea after it defeated China in a war in 1894 to 1895, one of their major opponents was Queen Min, the Korean queen. She was really smart and really politically savvy and was just really good at blocking Japanese political moves to try and take over Korea. So a Japanese diplomat had her assassinated. The Japanese diplomat paid a bunch of thugs, Japanese and Korean thugs, to break into the palace, kill the queen with swords, and then drag her body out into a back garden, pour, I believe it was kerosene on her body, and then burn it. This was extraordinarily brutal and led to massive criticism of Japan. And remember, Japan wants to put a good image on itself. It wants to say, we are responsible. It's good for Koreans that we're in Korea. And you could certainly point to this incident, as Koreans did, and say, oh, how is it good for Korea that you guys are here? You kind of killed our queen, right? And I was curious, how did George Ladd deal with that? So notice, I had background information. This is why if you want to write a paper, it's important to know something. If I just tried to just look at this in Korea with Maki Ito book and do nothing about Korea, I would not know where to start. Book's too big. It's too long. I would have been overwhelmed. But I knew about this incident because I have a background in it. And I knew this would be a case. So I don't have to read the whole entire book even to write my paper. I just need to find information in this one example. And that's what I did. I flipped through the book. I believe I used the PDF version because I could do a search for the word queen, and it would show up. And that helped me find examples of her. And then I just took notes. Right? I took lots of notes. I think I took about 20 or 30 pages of notes. That's probably overkill for anything you're doing. That's typical of what we do. In my case, I took a bunch of notes. So now I've got a bunch of notes, and I got to figure out how am I going to use these notes to write about the queen. Well, this is one reason why typing your notes is so important, because then you can use the edit find command. In Microsoft Word and many other word processors, you can do a find command. Usually it's in the edit menu, but in any case, you should be able to find it. Find the find command. And I just did a search for the word queen, and I made sure when I took my notes to use the word queen consistently, and it pops up every time there's the word queen. So it's really easy then for me to go through my notes and find every section that connects with the queen. Right? This is why taking good notes is so important. This is also why having a dual monitor is good, because what I could then do is I could copy and paste the various notes into a new document about the queen. Right? So okay, this stuff is all about the queen, copy paste here, copy paste here. That then lets me kind of play with it, lets me help organize it, so I can take those notes and start making something like an outline. Right here, I kind of cleaned things up, rewrote things so they made a little bit more sense. I've got my quotes here. Notice I've been careful about keeping my page numbers so I don't plagiarize by accident. But there you go. It's now coming clear. I've taken my notes. I'm putting them into something like an outline. And here, what I've done is, in that previous slide, I just had the notes. But here's a transition. Another difficult issue is Queen Min. Here's background information that was not in the Marquis Ito book, but I'm adding pro-Chinese Min family who use considerable political skills, blah, blah, blah. Then I start describing the summary, and there I have a quote. So here's the thing. People sometimes just try and sit down and just start typing without making an outline, or they just start typing with their notes. That's hard to do. I can't think historically and grammatically at the same time. But if you use this method, right, if you've got your notes, you copy paste them into a new document, so you have all the notes connected to one subject, that then allows you to make an outline. It lets you add the transitions, it lets you add the necessary background information, and then you can start typing. You just copy and paste these outline into your new document that becomes your rough draft. Gets a lot easier. Now here's the other thing. Here I am typing blah, 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 blah. And then I talk about that Japanese diplomat who plotted the assassination of the queen. And my problem there is, I forgot his full name. I just remembered his family name, Mura. But I forgot the rest of his name. So what do? Do I stop what I'm doing and spend, 10 minutes trying to find this guy's name, even though I'm on a roll? No. I write the word note. And here, I couldn't remember who all was killed. I knew it wasn't just the queen. I knew it was an attendant as well, but I wasn't sure how many other people died. So I just wrote note. And what I do is, when I'm done, I use the find command to find every place I wrote note, and I go in and fill in that information. So I went back after I had written that paragraph and I was ready to take a break, and I looked up Miura's name. I found his rest of his name is Goro, so I could just do find note. I found that. And then I looked up and see who died with her, and actually it was 2 attendants as well as the minister of the royal household, so I got that information straight. So that's how you can deal with that issue. So I want to now give you another example to show you how to analyze when you're writing. So here I've got this paragraph, and I'm writing, while Ladd preferred to avoid any specific instances of Japanese violence because it was so well known and could be raised an example of wanton Japanese hostility towards Korea, he did provide significant space to the late 16th century invasions of that country launched by Japanese hegemon Toyotomi Hideyoshi. So I have some background information, so I knew to look for this. I knew that Japan had invaded Korea in the 1590s. I said, I wonder how he deals with this. And he did deal with it. And again, this is where Koreans will say, look, the Japanese have it in for us. Look, they invaded us in the 1590s. So how does he deal with it? So in the travelogue section of With Ito, and you can give a, sometimes an abbreviated way of referring to a book. It was In Korea with Marquis Ito. I just said, from now on, With Ito. Ladd mentioned the invasion in connection to the city walls of Seoul. I just wrote a note because I wanted to check back to that. But rather than describing the devastation wrought by the Japanese armies, he emphasized the cowardice. No, I wanted to make sure I got the page number, but I didn't want to stop what I was doing to go look back and find it, of the Koreans who fled before the Japanese host. In the historical section of Ladd's work, he expanded upon the trope, and that should be Trope, but I made a mistake when I was typing. This is why you have to proofread a lot. Of Korean cowardice writing, and then I have a quote, when threatened by foreign invaders or by popular uprising and official rebellion at home, the court, a motley crowd or mob of king, palace officials, eunuchs, concubines, blind men, sorceresses, and other similar retainers of the palace, has as a rule precipitately fled to some place of refuge, deserted by official military escort in most miserable plight. Only when behind walls compelled to fight, or when aroused to a blind fury in the form of a mob, does the average Korean show the courage necessary to defend or to avenge his monarch. The saying of the Japanese, the Koreans are kittens in the field and tigers in the fortress, characterized their behavior during the Hideyoshi invasion. It is characteristic of them today. So I want to note, this is a quote. Notice I gave here the background information to help us understand what the quote is referring to. I talked about the invasion of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, right? And then I gave you an introduction of what it was going to be, right? I didn't just give, sometimes people just give a quote and it's like, okay, what does this mean? And you have to remember the person reading your paper may have no idea what this is about. So you have to give them an introduction. You have to give them background information so that people understand what you're talking about. And then I gave a big quote. But I didn't just stay there. I didn't just stop there and say, well, here's the quote, have fun. I discussed what it meant. Ladd thus portrayed Koreans, whether the rulers or people, as cowards who only fought when cornered or when driven by irrational emotion, right? Notice it says they don't have the courage. The Koreans are kitten in the field and tigers in the fortress, meaning they won't fight unless they have to. Koreans are essentially cowards. And that this cowardice was part of an unchanging national character. And notice I just remind the reader, has as a rule, it is characteristic of them today, right? What Ladd is trying to do is to say, you know, Koreans are just by nature cowards. They can't really take care of themselves. And rather than using the Japanese invasion as saying, you know, this is an example of Japan beating up on Korea, he's trying to deflect it, change the topic, and say this just is proof about how Koreans are cowards, and it's part of their national character. It's just the way Koreans are. And so he successfully changes rhetorically this attempt to criticize Japan into saying, well, no, actually Japan is good. It's Koreans who are bad, right? They're cowards who won't fight. So I just want to stress, notice I didn't just give the information. I'm making an argument. I'm explaining what this means. I'm engaging in analysis. To continue, one could point out that there had been great heroes in Korea who were brave. For instance, Admiral Lee Soon-shin won several significant victories against Japanese forces during Hideyoshi's invasion and died in battle. Right? So I'm saying, you know, someone who is pro-Korean and anti-Japanese could say, but wait a second, not all Koreans were cowards, certainly. Admiral Lee wasn't. And Admiral Lee was Korean, and so you can't just say Koreans by nature are cowards, because here's one who's not. And Ladd actually brings up Admiral Lee and writes, brave, loyal, and good men, when they have arisen to serve their monarch and their country, have never been permitted to flourish on Korean society. The braver, more loyal, and unselfish they have been, the more difficult has been the path to success of their endeavor, been made by a corrupt court and an ignorant and ungrateful populace. Right. So Ladd is going to now try and argue that, well, there are a few exceptional Koreans, but Koreans are just so bad whenever one of them is good, the other Koreans just tear him down. So to continue this, Ladd then referred directly to Lee, right, this great this great Korean admiral, who had in fact been a frequent victim of factional intrigues. Right? So it is true. Ladd is correct that Lee did have problems with his own government, but he did not mention that Lee had not worked alone, but had been served by capable subordinates and had trained Korean sailors, building a formidable fighting force. So Ladd is being selective in how he presents Korean history. He's leaving out details. This is why it's important that you stay focused on your topic so you learn enough about it to catch people when they make mistakes like this. This selective reading of the historical record is important, for to present E as he really was would have shown that Koreans were capable of self-reform. We have to remember, Ladd's argument is Koreans could not reform themselves and were naturally bad. And that so it was necessary for Japan to come in to reform them. And because Koreans are bad, they're going to fight back. And it was justifiable, since Koreans are bad and can't reform themselves, for Japan to use their violence to stop Korean violence. But Ladd has to be careful about this, because he wants to argue Koreans can't reform, but E is actually an example that Koreans could do something really well, right? That Koreans, I say, E is able to train these sailors and be brave, so you can't just say Koreans are cowards and will always be cowards. No. However, central to Ladd's argument was the idea that Koreans were incapable of real reform because of their national tendency to destroy the great among themselves, and they were therefore in need of Japan's guiding hand. And I have in parentheses, the fact that it was the Japanese that killed E rather than a Korean does not seem to have bothered Ladd. Right? E ultimately died in battle against the Japanese. Now, I don't expect you necessarily to get into this detail. My point here, though, is that in writing history, you have to provide evidence. Right? You have to provide evidence, and you have to analyze that evidence to make an argument. Right? I've made an argument here, and I provided evidence to support my argument.